Have you ever wondered why Jesus had to come back in the first century? Like, why didn't he come in the 21st century? Why, where you have some cameras, maybe some video work, some kind of hard copy evidence? Well, in this episode, we're talking about a selfie made in the first century. You guys stay tuned. Hey friends, we're back with another episode of the Remnant Radio, and today we're talking about this old, mysterious, scientifically examined relic of ancient history, or maybe it's a forgery. That's right, we're talking about the Shroud of Turin. It's an old linen cloth dating hopefully back to the days of Jesus. Many believe it is the actual burial cloth of Jesus himself. Now, what is the shroud? It's a 14 feet long by 3.5 feet wide linen cloth with a faint image of a man who appears to have been crucified. And the image, some say, is haunting. When I say some, I mean my wife. My wife thinks the picture is creepy. My 8-year-old daughter, on the other hand, says it's the coolest thing she's ever seen. So viewer discretion is advised. It shows in this shroud an image of a man. It's blood-stained, scourge marks, and even what looks like a wound from a crown of thorns. It gets its name not from any kind of biblical text, but Turin, the location where it is in Italy, where it's been housed since 1578. But the story doesn't start there. It supposedly travels from Jerusalem to Edessa, which is modern-day Turkey, and then Constantinople, and it finally finds its way into Europe through France, and then ends up there in Turin. You ever seen like the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you got Nazis coming to look for ancient relics? Well, this is a thing that actually happened in history, and apparently this was something that Hitler was interested in, this Shroud of Turin. So he sent Nazi soldiers after it, and a few local monks hid the thing away. It was also almost destroyed at one point in time by fire, and has been passed by through a line of noble families before the Catholic Church ever got their hands on it. But here's the big question: is it real? Is it a legit relic, or is it a medieval hoax? Now, if you're Protestant like me, you might be a little skeptical. Protestants grow up with what I would like to call a relic allergy that stems from the Protestant Reformation. Back in the day, relics were being passed around kind of like a church potluck. Everyone got to eat the casserole, but nobody knew exactly where it came from. And in that way, there was tons of relics that were circulating during the Protestant Reformation that were claimed to have origins, things like pieces of the cross. For example, you've got the Reformed theologian John Calvin, who writes against relics pretty frequently, and in one place says that there's enough shrouds, enough pieces of the true cross that you could rebuild an entire ship's cargo with all of those fragmented pieces. Or when he begins to talk about the Virgin Mary and how they have fragments of her hair and her breast milk. Like, I don't wish you can put it in a Ziploc bag. How are you going to keep that for 1,500 years? I don't know how they made these claims, but they were claiming that there's tons of relics, and these relics were used for penance. So if you went on a long journey to go visit these relics and, pray next to them, and you would receive grace that would be admitted to you so that you kind of get out of purgatory a little bit earlier. Some would claim that these relics would heal the sick, very similar to the bones of Elijah or the fringes of Jesus's garment, where the woman with the issue of blood reaches out and touches the fringes of Jesus's garment and she is healed. They would say, hey, look, God seems to endow certain objects with divine properties and giving them the ability to heal the sick. Well, this started a huge debate in the Protestant Reformation because as the Protestants examined these miracles, well, let me back up a little bit. Rome would say, hey, you guys aren't performing miracles, and we are performing miracles by these relics. We're clearly the true church. God has given us his stamp of approval. Well, when the Protestants then investigate, find out these are fake relics, and they're performing fake miracles. It's really the foundation of cessationism. It's responding to Roman Catholic excesses to say, hey, these supernatural gifts of healing ceased a long time ago with the apostles because we don't see any evidence for legit miracles. So Rome used these objects again, showing off their historical roots, giving a sense of penance for people and for miracles. So if you're out there and you're suspicious because of the history of these relics, I think rightfully so.
I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious.
Anyway, now if you have this skepticism, as I do, you can find more information that supposedly debunks the Shroud of Turin. Some critics say that the shroud is clearly a medieval hoax. After all, how could you keep a linen cloth alive for 2,000 years and keep it intact? In addition, there was some carbon dating that was given in 1988 that seems to confirm the shroud is from the Middle Ages, between 1260 and 1390 AD. So, case closed, right? Well, not so fast. A lot of the information that was released again in 1988 was under a veil of secrecy, and recently was released to the public, and we found out a little bit more information. So let's start with that first critique from 1988 on carbon dating. Turns out the sample used for the test came from a repaired section, a corner of cloth patched after fire damage. Chemical and textile analysis show that the piece of cotton and dyes that were found in that sample that was tested was not found in the rest of the shroud. In other words, they dated a Band-Aid, not the original linen cloth. More recent testing, like the 2022 X-ray wax method, dated the cloth to around the 1st century. So science is starting to catch up, saying this thing is a little bit older than we thought it was. And let's not forget that the shroud wasn't preserved by the Vatican until 1985. For a century, it was under the care of independent noble families. So this isn't a Catholic conspiracy relic. It could be an actual artifact from the 1st century. So Protestants, let's take a deep breath. Let's try to examine the information as objectively as possible without conflating it up to another Roman Catholic hoax. But even if the artifact was from the 1st century, does that really mean that is, in fact, the burial cloth of Jesus? Well, let's look at the evidence. I told you I was Protestant, but I was also raised in a Pentecostal church. And what we learned in that Pentecostal church was to start with the blood. What about the blood? But seriously, let's start with the blood. Studies have confirmed that the blood on the Shroud of Turin is human blood. And let's think about this critically. If you were going to make a fabrication in the medieval period, why not just run down the acrylic store of your local medieval arts and crafts store and paint it with that? Jokes aside. Or you could just pick up, like goat's blood or lamb's blood. There was no way in the medieval period to verify what kind of blood was on a piece of linen. If it was a fabrication, why go through all the painstaking effort to use human blood? It's gross and it seems impractical. Also, what was interesting is after studies were done on the Shroud of Turin, they found out that the type of blood was AB, which is more common in the Middle East, not in medieval Europe. Note only that it contains high levels of beryllium. And please, if you're a biology expert, don't give me a hard time. I read theology books, right? I don't know how to pronounce these words.
But what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
Beryllium, which is a chemical released in the body when you experience intense trauma like that of a crucifixion, like being scourged and crucified, right? And the wounds on the Shroud of Turin forensically are accurate. They cover 372 scourge mark consistent with Roman flagrum whips, right? The nails are also in the wrist of the person in the Shroud of Turin, where if you were in the medieval period, all of the art from that period had nails going through the hand. So they would have likely gotten that wrong if this was a fabrication, placing the nail in the hand, whereas in the Shroud of Turin, you see that the nails are going through the wrist. There is a spear wound in the side and a puncture mark around the scalp, which would match with a crown of thorns. Now, again, I just want you to think for a second objectively. People, even if you go back to the 1st century, they were not crucified this way, right? Sometimes they get scourged, sometimes they get crucified. But the image that we have is a man who was scourged and crucified, placed a crown of thorns on him, and punctured in the side. None of those things are consistent with typical crucifixion. But this individual in the Shroud of Turin has all of those marks. So if it is in fact a historical relic that dates back to the 1st century, it matches only one record of a man who was crucified that way, namely Jesus. Now, again, some claim that there is not a lot of historical evidence of the Shroud of Turin existing in ancient history, but that's not exactly true. The early church never mentions the phrase Shroud of Turin, but that's because the cloth likely went by different names, like the mandolin or the image of Edessa, which we do see throughout ancient church writings. Even Eusebius, a church father, speaks of sacred images not made with hands, which could point to the shroud, but we don't know if it does. We've got 6th century coins, and we have icons showing the same face that is seen in the shroud, which matches the wounds and proportions of the Shroud of Turin. Even the Hungarian prayer manuscript, 1190s, shows a burial cloth with the same hair-bone weave and distinctive burn holes found in the shroud. And again, that's 1190 when this prayer manuscript is in place, this Hungarian prayer manuscript that we have record of, and it draws out the Shroud of Turin, including burn marks and certain weaving patterns, which, again, if we're going to agree with the carbon dating says this is a forgery. The mid, like 1260s to the early 1300s, according to this prayer manuscript, we have a drawing of the Shroud of Turin, which predates that by quite a bit. So I think that's pretty compelling. Next, we have this information about pollen spores. Believe it or not, Remnant Radio has gone all the way down to talking about pollen spores in research. There was a guy who spent 5 years studying the various pollen spores inside of the Shroud of Turin. As he goes through all of the various spores, he found that they are from flowers that bloom in Jerusalem around Passover and not in Europe. The path of the pollen matches the historical journey from Jerusalem to Edessa, Constantinople, and then Europe. Textile experts say that the weave of the linen matches 1st century Jewish burial customs. Even the seam on the shroud is identical to stitching found only at Masada, a Jewish fortress that was destroyed in 73 AD. And, get this, they found that Jerusalem limestone dust on the feet and the knees of the man in the shroud. That's a lot of evidence pointing to the validity of this shroud being the very burial shroud of Jesus. In 1978, before Rome took charge of the shroud, a noble family in possession of the shroud tasked 40 scientists, again, secular scientists, to start the STURPS project, which stands for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. I don't know why, but everything has to have an acronym these days. They ran every test that you could think. They did x-rays. They did a chemical spectroscopy. Again, I can't pronounce these words. I'm just a guy who reads the Bible, okay? I'm just trying to relay the information. Ultraviolet imaging, and here's what they found, okay? They found some pretty cool stuff. No paint, no pigments, no brushstrokes. The image contains a 3D topographical data like that of a photo negative. The best explanation is a brief, intense burst of light that radiates and scorches the outer fibers of the linen cloth, but doesn't burn all the way through. Some call this the first selfie in human history. Scientists call it unexplainable. One researcher said that the energy required to create this image would be around 10 to the 16th power of watts. We're talking about 10 quadrillion watts. That's a 1 with 16 zeros following it, okay? All these researchers say it would have to take place, all of that wattage would have to take place in 1/billionth of a second, not to burn the rest of the fabric all the way through. So this would maybe be consistent with what we see on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus begins to glow and emit light in this kind of vibrant way. Again, I don't know. Nothing in the scriptures record. No one's in the tomb to give an eyewitness account of Jesus glowing in the tomb, but it at least seems plausible. Okay, so what do we say with all this? What does all this mean? Is the Shroud of Turin legit? Man, as I've looked at the data, and as I'm a skeptic, I don't want to believe in the data. I don't want to get fooled. I think it could be legit. I mean, I don't know definitively, but man, I think that there is some really compelling evidence, and it should only be supportive and like a tertiary evidence, a secondary standard or a third standard of evidence given to the validity of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. We have tons of accounts from Roman, Jewish, and Christian historians from that kind of region and time period giving record of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. He was a historical figure. The guys he discipled, they went on to die for their faith, to proclaim this truth. And some would say, well, it was all a lie. Well, you don't die for something you know is a lie. You might die for something you think is a lie, but you don't die for something you know for certain is a lie. They died for what they knew was true. Eyewitness accounts of the death, burial, and resurrection. So the Shroud of Turin, it could be an additional piece of evidence that we could add to the weight of this conversation about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. It could be a piece of historical evidence that we could use to engage apologetically with scientists atheists and skeptics to say, look, there seems to be physical hard copy evidence that we have at our hands. And I think that we should continue to do lots of scientific studies and research on the Shroud of Turin to see if it in fact is that very thing. So what do you think? Do you think this is a legit piece of Jesus' burial? Do you think it's a legit piece from ancient antiquity? Is it something from the 1st century? Or do you think it's still a fabrication? Tell me in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed that episode on the Shroud of Turin. Hopefully, Remnant Radio can be a one-stop shop for you in all things church history, theology, and the gifts of the Spirit. If you want to do some deep dives into theology, we do have an e-course that's made just for you. 40 lectures going through the historic Christian faith, an introduction to Christian theology is what we call it. I encourage you to go check that out on the website if that's something that you're interested in. But also, if you're out there and you're like, hey, man, have you made any other kind of historical videos like this? We did make a video on this thing called The Miracle of Holy Fire. Go check that out in the playlist up there. Make sure to subscribe and like the video.